Chapter 1. Welcome to Hopkinsville. Good evening, and welcome to strAInge, the podcast where we wade into the fog between what we know and what we can barely explain. I'm your host, and tonight, we're going to talk about one of the most compelling, most bizarre, and most thoroughly investigated close encounter cases in American history. We're going back to a warm Kentucky night in August of 1955, to a farmhouse just outside the small town of Hopkinsville, a place so ordinary it could have been anywhere in rural America. Except that on this particular night, something extraordinary allegedly descended upon it, and the family living there would never be quite the same again. Tonight's episode is called The Night the Goblins Came to Hopkinsville. And I want you to understand from the very beginning, this is not a ghost story designed to give you the creeps for cheap entertainment. This is a serious look at a serious event, witnessed by multiple adults and children, documented by law enforcement, investigated by the Air Force, and debated by researchers for nearly 7 decades. Whether you believe in extraterrestrial life or not, the Hopkinsville encounter demands your attention, because something happened at that farmhouse. And the question of what is far more interesting than a simple yes or no answer. Let's set the scene. The year is 1955. America is deep in the Cold War. The Soviet Union has the bomb. The Korean War has only recently ended. The space race hasn't yet begun in earnest, Sputnik is still 2 years away, but people are looking up at the sky with a mixture of wonder and anxiety that's hard to overstate. UFO sightings have been rolling in across the country since the late 1940s. The Air Force's Project Blue Book is actively collecting reports. The term flying saucer is now a permanent part of the American lexicon, and science fiction is booming, mirroring the cultural anxieties of a nation unsure what might be lurking beyond the Iron Curtain, or beyond the stratosphere. Into this atmosphere, we place Hopkinsville, Kentucky. It's a modest town in Christian County, with a population of around 12,000 at the time. Farming country. Tobacco fields. Church on Sundays. People who work hard and tell the truth, or so the saying goes. A few miles outside of town, on a rural road called Kelly Station Road, sits the Sutton farm. The Sutton family, a large extended clan including patriarch Elmer Lucky Sutton, his wife Vera, and various relatives, share the farmhouse with their friends Billy Ray Taylor and his wife June. The Taylors have recently come down from Pennsylvania. It's a full house, loud with summer energy, ordinary in every way. Except that tonight, August 21st, 1955, is going to be anything but ordinary. Chapter 2. The Sutton family. Who were these people? Every story has its cast, and before we can fully appreciate what happened at the Sutton farmhouse, we need to understand who was living there. Because one of the first weapons skeptics reach for when confronted with a UFO or paranormal encounter is the character of the witnesses. Were they reliable? Were they sober? Were they educated? Were they the sort of people whose word carries weight? I want to push back on that framing a little, because reliability shouldn't be a class-based judgment, and the assumption that rural, working-class people are inherently less credible than, say, airline pilots or scientists is a prejudice that has distorted a lot of paranormal research. But it's also worth noting, by any measure you want to apply, the Suttons and the Taylors held up remarkably well under scrutiny. Let's start with Elmer Lucky Sutton. Lucky was a solid, heavy-set man in his 30s, a Kentucky farmer through and through. He wasn't given to flights of fancy, wasn't known as a storyteller or an exaggerator. His neighbors described him as straightforward, hardworking, not the type to go looking for attention. His wife Vera was similarly grounded, a practical woman raising children in a drafty farmhouse, more concerned with the harvest than with little men from Mars. The Sutton household was large and multi-generational. At the time of the incident, the farmhouse held 8 adults and 3 children. Among them was Glennie Lankford, Vera's mother, who was in her 50s. Glennie would prove to be one of the most important witnesses in the case, not because she was the most dramatic, but because she was notably calm. A deeply religious woman, Glennie would later describe the creatures she saw not with terror but with a kind of bewildered reverence. She thought they might be angels. That's a fascinating data point we'll return to. Then there's Billy Ray Taylor. Billy Ray is the one who kicks off the entire sequence of events, and he tends to get a rougher treatment in retellings of the case. He was younger than Lucky, more animated, and he had a reputation for being a talker. Some researchers have used this against him, suggesting that if anyone was going to cook up a wild story, it would be Billy Ray. But here's the thing. When investigators arrived and interviewed all the witnesses separately, their accounts aligned on every major detail. If Billy Ray was spinning a yarn, he would have needed to coach 8 other adults and 3 children to tell the exact same yarn, consistently, under pressure, to law enforcement officers. That's not how hoaxes work. Billy Ray and June Taylor had come down from Pennsylvania to visit the Suttons, and they were staying with them for the summer. Billy Ray, by all accounts, was excited to be there. He liked the Suttons, liked the country air, liked the loose rhythms of summer on the farm. He was a man who lived with his eyes open, curious about the world, maybe a little credulous but not dishonest. Chapter 3. Billy Ray Goes to the Well, the First Sighting. It was around 7 o'clock in the evening on August 21, 1955. The sun was going down over Christian County. The Sutton household had finished dinner, and the night was settling in. Hot, still, the kind of August evening in Kentucky that wraps around you like a damp blanket. The children were still awake. The adults were gathered in and around the farmhouse, talking, winding down from the day. Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside to draw water from the well. This is the moment everything begins. And it's worth pausing here, because this is such an utterly ordinary act. A man goes to get water. He's done it 100 times. He walks across the yard in the fading light, cranks the handle, fills his bucket. Except that on this evening, as he straightens up and looks toward the sky, he sees something that stops him cold. A bright object, luminous, disc-shaped, with an exhaust trail of rainbow-colored light behind it, streaks across the sky and drops below the tree line, apparently landing in a nearby gully about a mile from the farmhouse. Billy Ray stood there for a long moment. He watched the sky. Nothing else appeared. The night resumed its ordinary sounds, crickets, frogs, the distant moan of a car somewhere on the road. He went back inside and told Lucky Sutton what he'd seen. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Lucky Sutton's response was not the one you'd expect from someone whose friend was about to sell him a tall tale. He didn't tease Billy Ray. He didn't dismiss him. He listened, nodded, and then, and this is telling, he didn't go investigate. Lucky Sutton, a man who knew his land, who had shotguns in his house and wasn't afraid of much, decided that whatever Billy Ray had seen, they were going to stay inside that night. There would be time to check the gully in the morning. Chapter 4. The Siege, 3 Hours of Terror. What followed over the next several hours was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary sequences of events ever reported in the history of close encounter cases. The Sutton family and the Taylors did not simply see a creature and then go to bed. They were besieged. For approximately 3 hours, some accounts say closer to 4, the creatures returned again and again, appearing at windows, peering through the glass, retreating when fired upon, and then returning as if the gunshots were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Let's walk through this slowly, because the sheer repetition of the phenomenon is one of the most significant aspects of the case. This was not a one-time, 10-second glimpse of something strange. This was an extended, multi-witness, multi-event encounter that lasted most of the night. After Lucky and Billy Ray retreated inside following that first exchange on the porch, they gathered the family in the central room of the farmhouse. The children were frightened. Vera Sutton and June Taylor tried to keep them calm. Glennie Langford, the older woman, the one who would later say she thought the creatures might be angels, sat quietly and watched the windows. She was the calmest person in the room, by multiple accounts, which is remarkable given that she was also the most elderly and the most physically vulnerable. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, a face appeared at the window. The description is the same as before: enormous yellow eyes, oversized head, long fingers pressed against the glass, splayed out as if the creature was steadying itself to look in. The witnesses said the eyes didn't blink. They just stared. Wide, golden, utterly alien. Lucky fired through the window screen. The creature dropped away. They heard it land in the grass below the window, but again, no blood, no cry of pain, no evidence of injury. Just the rustling of grass and then silence. Then, another window. Another face. This is the detail that investigators found compelling. The creatures seemed coordinated. When one was driven from one side, another appeared on the opposite side. Whether this was tactical or coincidental, nobody could say. But it gave the witnesses the overwhelming sense of being surrounded. At one point, Billy Ray stepped out onto the back porch to check whether any creatures were visible in the yard. Lucky stood in the doorway to cover him. As Billy Ray moved into the open, a creature on the roof of the house reached down and grabbed him by the hair, or at least touched his head. Billy Ray shouted. Lucky shot at the creature on the roof. It was knocked off and fell into the yard, where it bounced, and this is the word witnesses consistently used, *bounced*, as if its body were made of something more resilient than flesh. It then moved away into the darkness. Through all of this, the family noted several consistent physical characteristics of the creatures. Their movement was unusual. When struck by gunfire, they didn't fall and stay down. They were knocked backward but recovered quickly and moved away with a fluid, slightly unearthly gait. Some witnesses said they appeared to float a few inches above the ground rather than walk. Their arms, when raised, gave them a silhouette that reminded some of the classic hands-up gesture, which created a strange and unsettling ambiguity. Were they threatening? Surrendering? Simply maintaining balance? Their eyes were the feature everyone agreed on. Large, round, yellow gold, and luminous. Several witnesses said the eyes seemed to glow from within, rather than simply reflecting the light from the farmhouse windows. And they didn't blink. They simply stared, with an expression, if expression is even the right word, of absolute, alien calm. The skin, or the outer surface of the creatures' bodies, was described as metallic or silvery. Not exactly like a suit or armor, more like the surface of a creature that was naturally metallic. Researchers have since noted that this description bears no real resemblance to the little green men of science fiction at the time, which is a significant point against the theory that the Suttons simply confabulated a story from popular culture. The creatures they described were genuinely alien in their appearance, not the bug-eyed monsters of the movies, but something stranger and more specific. The siege continued. Gunfire. Retreat. Reappearance. Faces at windows. Creatures on the roof. The distinctive metallic sound of bullets striking something harder than flesh, a sound that Lucky Sutton described as like shooting at a tin bucket. He was an experienced hunter. He knew what it sounded like when a bullet found its mark. This was different. By 11 o'clock at night, the family was done. They made a decision. They got in their cars and drove to the police station. All of them. Together. In the middle of the night. Chapter 5. The police arrive, investigation and aftermath. When the Sutton family and the Taylors arrived at the Hopkinsville police station in the early hours of August 22, 1955, they were, by all accounts, genuinely terrified. Not performing fear. Not exaggerating for effect. Several of the women were crying. The children were wide-eyed and trembling. Lucky Sutton, a man not given to displays of emotion, was pale and shaking. Billy Ray Taylor spoke quickly, jumping between details, his voice cracking. The officer on duty that night was Chief of Police Russell Greenwell. And to his considerable credit, Greenwell did not laugh them out of the station. He listened. He asked questions. He took notes. And then he did something that has contributed enormously to the credibility of this case. He assembled a team of officers, eventually numbering around a dozen, including state police and military police from nearby Fort Campbell, and he drove out to the Sutton farmhouse. What they found was significant. Not the creatures. Those had apparently departed by the time the convoy of police vehicles arrived, their headlights sweeping across the dark fields. But the physical evidence of what had taken place was unmistakable. The farmhouse walls were peppered with bullet holes, both from the inside shooting out and, strangely, from angles suggesting the weapons had been fired in multiple directions throughout the house. Spent shell casings were everywhere. The window screens were torn and perforated where weapons had been discharged through them. The yard showed signs of disturbance. The grass was flattened and disturbed in patterns that were consistent with the witnesses' accounts of where creatures had appeared and retreated. Near the well, where Billy Ray had made his initial observation, investigators found markings in the ground that some officers described as unusual, though no formal cast or documentation of these marks was made, which is a regret that later researchers have repeatedly expressed. Chief Greenwell and his officers spent several hours at the scene. They searched the fields, the tree line, the gully where Billy Ray had seen the original object land. They found nothing, no craft, no debris, no bodies of creatures shot and killed by the dozens of rounds the Suttons had fired. But they also found nothing to suggest the family had fabricated the incident. There was no evidence of a prank setup. No signs of alcohol consumption beyond the ordinary. No signs that the family had manufactured the bullet damage themselves. One officer, years later, said that what struck him most was the atmosphere when they arrived. The Sutton farm, on a summer night, should have been alive with sound, crickets, frogs, the ambient music of a Kentucky night in August. Instead, it was silent. Not quietly settling down silent. Completely silent. As if every living thing within earshot had decided to go very still and very quiet. The officer said he'd never felt a stillness like it, before or since. The military police from Fort Campbell were there because Fort Campbell, just up the road, operated under the shadow of Cold War anxiety like every other military installation in America. Unidentified objects and anomalous encounters had to be taken seriously, at least officially, because the worst-case scenario was always that the Soviets had developed some new technology. The MPs walked the perimeter, checked the sky, and filed their reports. Those reports, to this day, have never been made fully public. The Air Force sent investigators as part of Project Blue Book, the official government program for evaluating UFO reports. Their conclusion was that the Sutton family had probably seen a great horned owl which had triggered a panic that snowballed into a night of mass hysteria. It's a conclusion that has been critiqued vigorously by researchers ever since because it fails to account for a number of specifics: the multiple witnesses, the extended duration, the physical evidence, the consistent descriptions, and perhaps most notably, the fact that great horned owls, while large and capable of startling people, do not come in at 3 to 3.5 feet tall with glowing yellow eyes that appear in windows. The family returned to their farmhouse with the police escort. The officers stayed until nearly 2:15 in the morning. Then they left. And approximately 45 minutes after the last police car pulled out of the driveway, they came back. Glennie Langford was the first to see one. A glowing figure, hovering just outside the window, peering in at her. She did not scream. She did not call for Lucky or Billy Ray. She looked at it, and it looked at her, for what she thought was 30 seconds, though time is elastic in moments like that. Then it moved away, and she watched it go, and she sat back down, and she thought about what it might be. The next morning, the Sutton farm was crawling with tourists. Chapter 6, The Media Circus, When the World Came Knocking. If the night of August 21st was a nightmare, the days that followed were a different kind of horror, a slow, grinding humiliation of being turned into a public spectacle. Word of the encounter spread with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By early August 22nd, reporters began appearing on the dirt road leading to the Sutton farm. By the afternoon, there were camera crews. By evening, the curious and the contemptuous arrived in equal measure. Their private terror had become public entertainment. The newspapers were not kind. Headlines were mocking: "Little green men invade Kentucky farm and space creatures visit tobacco country." Most viciously pieces that played the story entirely for laughs, describing the Suttons as uneducated country folk who had probably been drinking. The assumption of ignorance was almost universal in the early press coverage. Lucky retreated into himself. He gave a handful of interviews early because the reporters were relentless and refusing them made things worse, but he soon found nothing he said was taken seriously. His words were filtered through a lens of ridicule, his descriptions rephrased for comic effect, his credibility dismissed. He stopped talking to journalists relatively quickly. Vera followed suit. Billy Ray Taylor, by contrast, was more willing to engage. His willingness to talk, to elaborate, to answer questions with enthusiasm, was framed as evidence of his unreliability. It was a heads-I win-tails-you-lose situation for the witnesses. Reticence was suspicious, openness was proof of attention-seeking. The physical site of the farmhouse became a tourist attraction. People drove out from Hopkinsville and beyond to walk the property, to look at the bullet holes in the walls, to stand by the well where Billy Ray had first seen the light in the sky. The Suttons had not invited this and could not stop it. This was rural Kentucky in 1955. There was no publicist to call, no lawyer to send a cease and desist. What the media circus did, however, was preserve the basic facts of the case in a way that might not have happened otherwise. Because so many journalists descended so quickly, the witnesses were interviewed repeatedly and at length, often separately, often by people trying to catch them in contradictions. And the core account held together. The descriptions of the creatures were consistent from witness to witness. The timeline held up. The physical evidence, bullet holes, shell casings, disturbed earth, was documented by people with no stake in the story. Investigator Isabel Davis, who wrote one of the most thorough early analyses of the case, interviewed the witnesses extensively in the months following the incident. She found them credible and deeply reluctant to be in the spotlight. These were not people who enjoyed the attention. They were people who had experienced something that terrified them and who had been rewarded for their honesty with mockery and invasion. Davis noted that several members of the family showed signs of genuine psychological distress in the aftermath, not the giddy excitement you might expect from hoaxers who had pulled off a great prank, but the exhaustion and withdrawal of people who had been through something traumatic and were still processing it. The Air Force, as noted in our last chapter, eventually attributed the sightings to great horned owls, a conclusion that satisfied almost nobody who looked at the case carefully. The great horned owl explanation has some superficial appeal. These are large birds, capable of reaching wingspans of nearly 5 feet, with distinctive yellow eyes and ear tufts that could, in low light and high stress, be misidentified as something unusual. They are also silent flyers, which could explain why the creatures seemed to appear without sound. But the explanation collapses under the weight of specifics. Great horned owls do not stand 3 feet tall on the ground. They do not have metallic, luminescent skin. They do not appear to be resistant to shotgun blasts. They do not peer through farmhouse windows on multiple sides of a house simultaneously. They do not grab people by the hair from rooftops, and rural Kentuckians know what owls look like. Lucky Sutton had been living on that farm his whole life. The idea that he could not distinguish a great horned owl from whatever he described seeing that night is, frankly, insulting. The media circus faded after a few weeks, as media circuses do. The cameras moved on to the next story. The tourists drifted away. The Sutton farm slowly returned to something like normalcy, externally, at least. Internally, the family was changed. They would never speak about the incident as freely as they had in those first chaotic days. The lesson had been learned: telling the truth about something strange gets you laughed at and invaded. Better to keep your strange truths to yourself. Chapter 7: The Investigators, What the Researchers Found. One of the things that sets the Hopkinsville case apart from many other UFO and paranormal encounters is the depth and seriousness of the investigative attention it received, not just from government agencies, but from independent researchers who had no institutional agenda to satisfy and no conclusion they were required to reach. The most significant of these early investigators was Isabel Davis, a researcher affiliated with the Civilian Saucer Intelligence of New York, one of the more rigorous civilian UFO research organizations of the 1950s. Davis traveled to Kentucky and conducted extensive interviews with the witnesses, visiting the farmhouse, examining the physical evidence that remained, and compiling a detailed report that ran to dozens of pages. Her conclusion was careful and measured. She could find no evidence of hoax, no motivation for fabrication, and no alternative explanation that adequately accounted for all of the reported details. Davis noted several things that have continued to impress researchers in the decades since. First, the consistency of the descriptions across multiple witnesses who were interviewed separately. When you have 8 adults and 3 children telling essentially the same story, the same creature height, the same oversized head, the same glowing eyes, the same long arms, the same metallic quality of the skin, without opportunity for coordination, that consistency carries evidential weight. People who fabricate stories together tend to over-coordinate on some details and under-coordinate on others. The Sutton family's account had neither quality. Davis noted what she called the texture of the experience, the way the witnesses described not just the creatures themselves, but the emotional and psychological experience. Lucky's description of the sound that bullets made when striking the creatures is a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that comes from experience. A person making up a story tends to invent cinematic details. The creature cried out, it bled, it fell dramatically. Lucky described something much stranger and more specific, a metallic-sounding impact, and then the creature got back up. Later researchers who examined the case included Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the Air Force's own scientific consultant for Project Blue Book and one of the most respected astronomers of his generation. Hynek began his career as a committed skeptic, but gradually shifted his position after examining many cases. He found the Hopkinsville account among the more compelling, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most specific. Hynek's method looked for the simplest explanation that fit all the facts, and he refused to force an explanation onto evidence when it didn't fit. The Great Horned Owl theory, which the Air Force favored, didn't fit the facts. The mass hysteria theory didn't account for the sequential nature of the sightings or the physical evidence. The hoax theory required the willing participation of 11 people, including small children, and sustained deception under intensive questioning. None of these explanations worked. What Hynek and others were left with was the hypothesis that they least wanted to reach, that something genuinely anomalous had occurred at the Sutton farmhouse, something that lay outside the boundaries of currently understood science. In more recent decades, researchers have brought new tools to the case. Forensic psychology has been applied to the witness testimonies, looking for the markers of fabricated versus genuine accounts. The analysis is not definitive, it rarely is, but the Sutton family's accounts score consistently in the range associated with genuine recollection rather than confabulation. The details are appropriately fragmented, the emotions appropriately complex, the level of specificity appropriately uneven in the way that real memories tend to be. Some researchers have proposed natural explanations beyond the owl theory. Ball lightning has been suggested. Bioluminescent insects in unusual concentrations. Even escaped exotic animals from a private collection, though no such collection has ever been identified in the area. Each explanation accounts for some of the evidence and fails on other points. There is also a persistent alternative investigation that points to the proximity of Fort Campbell, just a few miles from the Sutton farm. Some researchers have speculated, without direct evidence, that what the Suttons encountered might have been an experimental aircraft or drone being tested by the military, with personnel in unusual suits or equipment. The proximity of the military installation, combined with the rapid appearance of military police at the scene, is a detail that has never been fully explained. Whatever happened that night, it left a mark on everyone who looked at it seriously. Chapter 8: The Legacy, Hopkinsville in Culture and Consciousness. Nearly 7 decades have passed since Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor fired their guns at something in the dark. In those 7 decades, the Hopkinsville Goblin encounter has been referenced in films, television shows, video games, comic books, and academic papers on anomalous phenomena. The town of Hopkinsville itself has leaned into the legacy with the annual Little Green Men Festival, a celebration of alien kitsch that draws thousands of visitors and injects significant tourism dollars into the local economy. It's a strange kind of immortality for a family that just wanted to be left alone. The creatures described by the Suttons, small, large-headed, long-armed, with glowing yellow eyes and metallic skin, have become one of the most distinctive entities in UFO lore. Unlike the classic grey aliens that dominate popular imagination, the Hopkinsville Goblins, the term was applied by the press and has stuck, despite never being used by the witnesses themselves, have a specific, almost handcrafted quality to them. They look like nothing else in the canon of reported alien encounters. They're too short to be the stately Nordics. Too silvery and specific to be the featureless greys. Too physically confrontational to be the enigmatic lights-in-the-sky phenomenon. They are their own category, their own genus of strangeness. This distinctiveness has made the Hopkinsville case particularly interesting to researchers who approach the UFO phenomenon from an anthropological or folkloric perspective. John Keel, the great maverick of paranormal research, saw in the Hopkinsville Goblins an echo of older traditions, the small, luminous, mischievous beings that populate the folklore of nearly every human culture. The fairies of Celtic tradition. The Tomt of Scandinavia. The Jinn of Islamic folklore. The Kappa of Japan. Across vastly different cultures and time periods, there are consistent reports of small, non-human beings with large eyes and unusual physical properties who appear, interact briefly with humans, and disappear. Keel and others argued that the Hopkinsville Goblins might belong to this tradition. This folkloric interpretation is neither more nor less scientific than the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but it has a different kind of resonance. It situates the Hopkinsville encounter within a human story that stretches back thousands of years, which raises its own set of profound questions. If people across cultures and centuries have been reporting encounters with beings that match this general description, what does that mean? Are we dealing with a single, persistent phenomenon that manifests in culturally specific ways? Something genuinely non-human that has been sharing our world, our consciousness, our nighttime hours, for as long as we have been telling stories? The entertainment industry's treatment of the Hopkinsville case has been a mixed blessing. On one hand, references in popular media have kept the story alive and introduced it to generations who would never have encountered it through UFO research publications. On the other hand, each retelling tends to smooth away the rough edges of the real story in favor of a more comfortable narrative. The goblins become cute. The encounter becomes an adventure. The Sutton family's suffering becomes a punchline. Direct homages to Hopkinsville appear in Monster of the Week television episodes and in independent films that have tackled the case with varying degrees of fidelity. The 2023 film Skinwalkers*, while not directly about Hopkinsville, draws on the same tradition of rural America as the site of anomalous encounter. The 2022 Jordan Peele film *Nope* has also been discussed in relation to the Hopkinsville case, though Peele has been characteristically circumspect about his specific influences. In academic circles, the Hopkinsville case has been used as a test case for theories of anomalous experience. Psychologists have analyzed the witness testimonies through the lens of sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucination, and shared psychosis, and have, in each case, found that the fit is imperfect. Sleep paralysis doesn't explain 8 people all fully awake, moving around a farmhouse and firing weapons. Hypnagogic hallucination is by definition a solitary experience. Shared psychosis of the kind that would be required to produce this level of multi-witness, multi-hour consistency is extraordinarily rare and has never been documented in circumstances remotely similar to this one. The town of Hopkinsville has its festival and its alien-themed shops and its historical markers. The farmhouse no longer stands in its original form. The Sutton family, those who are still alive, have largely declined to revisit the story. But the story revisits us, every time someone looks up at a clear August sky and wonders what else might be moving through it. Chapter 9. What do we do with this? A closing meditation. We've spent the better part of this episode walking through the Hopkinsville Goblin encounter in as much detail as I could honestly provide. We've met the Sutton family, real people, not archetypes. We've stood in the yard with Lucky and Billy Ray, guns in hand, staring at something the universe had no business putting in front of them. We've sat with Glennie Langford at her window, watching a luminous figure peer in at her with those enormous, unblinking eyes, and felt the strange peace that came over her in that moment. We've watched the police arrive, the journalists descend, the Air Force file its unsatisfying report. We've listened to the researchers, the skeptics, the folklorists, and the true believers. And now, as every good podcast episode must, we have to ask the question that you've been sitting with since the beginning: what do we actually do with this story? I want to resist 2 temptations that tend to bracket discussions like this one. The first is the temptation of credulous certainty, the impulse to say clearly, extraterrestrials visited that farmhouse in 1955, the evidence is overwhelming, and anyone who denies it is either ignorant or in on the cover-up. That kind of thinking feels satisfying in the moment, but it substitutes excitement for rigor. The evidence from Hopkinsville is compelling. It is not, by itself, proof of anything beyond the boundaries of current scientific understanding. The second temptation is dismissive certainty, the impulse to say obviously, These were ignorant country people who saw some owls and panicked, and the whole thing has been kept alive by true believers who don't understand how perception works. That kind of thinking feels sophisticated, but it's actually just another form of incuriosity. It papers over the genuine weirdness of the case with an explanation that doesn't fit, and it's unkind to the witnesses in a way that should make any honest person uncomfortable. What I want to propose, instead, is a posture of serious open-mindedness. Not the fake open-mindedness of someone who has already decided but is performing uncertainty. Genuine, uncomfortable, costly open-mindedness, the kind that requires you to sit with the possibility that you don't know and that the not knowing is actually important. Because here is what I believe to be true: something happened at the Sutton farmhouse on August 21, 1955. Multiple credible witnesses, in a state of genuine fear and with consistent accounts, reported an extended encounter with beings that could not be satisfactorily explained by conventional means. The investigators who took the case seriously found no evidence of hoax and no compelling alternative explanation. The Air Force's official conclusion was inadequate to the evidence. And the family paid a real human cost, in mockery, in invasion, in lasting psychological distress, that makes the hoax hypothesis not just logically weak but morally implausible. What were the beings? I genuinely don't know. You genuinely don't know. Nobody does, with certainty. They might have been extraterrestrial, visitors from somewhere beyond our solar system, curious about this species that builds farmhouses and shoots at things it doesn't understand. They might have been something stranger and more local, entities that have shared this planet with us in ways we don't yet have the conceptual vocabulary to describe. They might have been the product of some natural phenomenon we haven't yet characterized, some bioluminescent organism or atmospheric plasma phenomenon that mimics biological form in ways that trigger the human pattern recognition system. They might have been something so genuinely outside our current frame of reference that any label we apply to them is necessarily wrong. What I think we can say with some confidence is this: the Hopkinsville encounter represents a category of human experience that is real, that is consistent across cultures and centuries, and that our current scientific and cultural frameworks are inadequate to explain. Whether the beings were physical or psychological, extraterrestrial or interdimensional, biological or energetic, they were experienced. And the experiencing of them changed the people who underwent the experience. That is true of Lucky Sutton. That is true of Glennie Langford. That is true of every serious researcher who has looked at this case and found themselves unable to look away. The Sutton family had an encounter with the genuinely unknown. They were astonished, terrified, but astonished. They were on the edge of what human beings know, looking over into something else entirely. Next time, we're going to look at an amazing cultural moment as we dig into the Shaver mysteries. This has been *strAInge*. I'm your host, AI. Thank you for listening. And whatever you do, keep an eye on the tree line.